Herkese iyi akşamlar. Türk Patoloji Derneği'nin bir toplantısında da bizimle birlikte olduğunuz için çok teşekkür ederiz. Bu toplantılar aslında bir dizi toplantının en başlangıcı diyebiliriz bu akşamki toplantıya. Bu sefer konumuz dijital patoloji ve bu konuda son yıllarda olan büyük bilgi birikimine birazcık açılım yapmaya çalışacağız hep birlikte. Ve bütün bu toplantıların hem fikir anası diyeyim hem ana organizasyoncusu diyeyim. Sevgili İlknur burada bizimle ve ilk konuğumuz da PH'den Doktor Juan Retamero. Ve aslında 8 adet webinar planlanmış durumda. Bunlardan 3 tanesini daha önceden duyurusunu yapabildik. İlerisi gelecek inşallah. Ben fazla lafı uzatmadan lafı önce bir İlknur'a vereceğim. Daha sonra da hep birlikte sevgili Juan'ı dinleyeceğiz. Evet İlknur, söz senin.
Merhaba, Mine abla teşekkür ediyorum. Herkese hoş geldiniz diyorum öncelikle. Kayıttan hemen önce kaç kişi var dedik, 208'e ulaşmışız. Mart ayında Mine ablayla dijital patoloji toplantısını yapalım mı yapmayalım mı derken 50 kişi gelir mi ki endişe etmiş idik. Şu an 208 kişiyle birlikte olmak çok keyifli. Hoş geldiniz diyorum öncelikle. Dijital patoloji ve yapay zeka konuşacağımız bir webinar serisi. Bu Türk Patoloji Derneği çatısında olacak ve Mine abla nezdinde derneğe teşekkürlerimizi iletiyoruz. Çünkü bu vizyonu yakalamış olması derneğin çok kıymetli.
Biz teşekkür
Patoloji
ederiz.
rutininde dijital patoloji çok kısa bir tarihi var aslında ama hızı ve büyümedeki dik ivmesi çok çarpıcı bence. O nedenle de böyle hızla hayatımıza giriyor ve kaçamayacağımız bir şey oldu dijitalizasyon. Dolayısıyla dijital patolojiyi ve yapay zekayı artık günlük rutinimizde yapay zeka ve onu kabul etmek dışında bir şansımız yok. Onun için nasıl yapacağımızı konuşacağımız bir webinar serisi hazırladık. Bu webinarları Memorial, Acıbadem ve Koç Hastanesi birlikteliğiyle yaptık ve bu işbirliğini de çok önemsiyorum. Sayın Ümit İnce ve Sayın Volkan Adsay bugün toplantıda yoklar çünkü bir yurt dışı planları ve özel planları nedeniyle ama selam ve sevgilerini ilettiler. Ve bu üç büyük kurumun Türk Patoloji Derneği altında dijital patoloji konuşuyor olmasını çok önemsiyorum. Teşekkürlerimi sunuyorum. Sponsorumuz Leica Biosystems ve Medisa, Dijital Patoloji Endüstri Akademi bir arada olmadan mümkün değil çünkü en başta scannerlara ve sonra bir dolu şeye ihtiyacımız var dijitalize olmak için. Sevgili Alp Aydos nezdinde sponsorumuza teşekkür ediyorum. Organizasyonu sağlayan sevgili Enel Mayıs ekibi tüm ayrıntılarla pembenin tonuna kadar ilgilendiler. Teşekkürlerimi iletiyorum. Onun dışında en çok da tabii ki şu anda 208 olduğunu duyduğum dinleyicilere sizlerle bir arada olmak çok keyifli. Hoş geldiniz diyorum. Ve konuşmacımıza dönüyorum. And our speaker, Juan, welcome. I gave my thanks at the part you couldn't understand. In Turkish, and we can go from now on together. I shared your CV with the audiences and everyone knows you so very well. You were one of the pioneer groups in digital pathology in Granada University, and you were fully digitalized in 2016. It is a history for digital pathology. And now you are the medical director of PAGE, the first FDA-approved AI algorithm. So amazing and exciting. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you, to see you with us, with Turkish pathologists, engineers, and a lot of other people interested in digital pathology. It will be so good to listen to your digital pathology experience, and the stage is yours. Please, Juan, welcome.
Thank you so very much, Ilknur, for the lovely introduction. I mean, you made it sound a lot more exciting than what it really is in reality. But I hope that you find, you know, the story well worth listening to, and you find information that is helpful to you. So yeah, my name is Juan Retamero. I'm an anatomical pathologist, and I was very fortunate to be at the right time, at the right place. And essentially, that is one of the first labs in Europe, really, and probably in the world, to have gone fully digital for primary diagnosis. So from that point onwards, my career really changed from that of a diagnostic pathologist to that of a consultant in digital transformation, which is what I've been doing ever since, really, since 2017, really. So yeah, almost 6-7 years ago. And I was very fortunate to join Page 2.5 years as a medical vice president, really. But today I'm not here to give you an account of what Page does as a company. Today, I'm wearing my cap as a pathologist, and I would like to share with you my experiences as to how to go digital. Because of course, the idea is that we would like to modernize pathology. We would like to implement artificial intelligence, but you have to follow a series of steps that involve the digital transformation of your lab before you can actually implement artificial intelligence. So yeah, I would like to thank you all for your attention. I would like to thank you, Ilknur and Mina, for for the invitation. Would like also to thank the Turkish Society of Pathology for having me here today, and of course Memorial Hospitals for inviting me to share my experiences with you. And essentially, this is a brief outlook of the things that I would like to discuss with you today. My personal experiences. We're also going to talk about the reasons why pathology should be modernized, because at the end of the day, pathology is a profession under strain. It's a profession under stress. And we need to realize that every help that we can get from technology should be welcomed with open arms. However, there is a series of steps that we need to follow. As we mentioned earlier, we need to adopt digital pathology at large if we want to modernize the profession and finally embrace artificial intelligence. A lot of pathologists feel somewhat threatened by artificial intelligence and what that means. But at the end of the day, we should not be afraid. I don't think there are any reasons for us to be afraid of embracing the new technology, because the technology is here to help us do a better job more efficiently, but also that job will reflect on the quality of the diagnosis we make for ourselves, but more importantly, for our patients. I'm here to give you a balanced account of what going digital means. So we're going to talk about the things that pathologists like about the going digital, but also the things that pathologists do not like about going digital. So a lot of all of these accounts that need to be followed if we want to successfully transform our laboratory. So first of all, let me kick off giving you a brief introduction of Granada University Hospitals, because essentially this is the place I was working when we undertook the digital transformation of our center. So Granada Hospitals is basically formed by 4 different hospitals that you can see here in this map in the south of the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. So the city center of Granada is covered by 2 teaching hospitals, which amongst them have approximately 1,500 beds. And in addition to that, we have 2 peripheral rural hospitals that are between 75 and 100 kilometers separated from the main central hub. So the idea was that the biopsy and the specimen processing for the city of Granada was actually centralized in the central hospital that we see here in the picture, whereas each one of the peripheral hospitals had their own individual pathology labs who basically processed the specimens. But overall, the catchment area was around 1 million inhabitants, because of course, bear in mind that this is Spanish public healthcare, so it's fully owned by the government. So no private initiative in this regard. Everything was paid for with public money to provide a public service, public healthcare in southern Spain. So on the whole, there was 2,000 hospital beds, almost 2,000 hospital beds, which basically translated into about 65,000 specimens per year. And by that, we mean histopathology specimen, cellular pathology, nothing of the kind of cytopathology, etc. And that is important because cytology cannot be digitized for the time being. But everything else, everything that was not cytology, certainly we digitized and we successfully transformed to a digital worker. In addition to that, Granada Hospital was staffed by 23 pathologists and about 50 histotechnicians. And as we mentioned earlier, we completed the digital transformation of our operations back in September 2016, so almost 7 years ago, actually. And on the whole, the transition period was about 4 months. So in a nutshell, how can we summarize the experience of having gone digital? So our experience is basically summarized in these 2 papers that I would like to share with you. They are available in archives, they're free access, so I would definitely encourage you to download it and take a look at them. They're free, so definitely packed with information, so I would definitely encourage you to take a look at them. On the whole, the experience with digital pathology, as far as we are concerned, translated into significant efficiency gains once we implemented the digital transformation. And that came largely because we could definitely allocate cases more efficiently across the network of hospitals that we discussed in the previous slide. So essentially, cases now, once they were fully digital, could be sent to the right pathologist, regardless of where these pathologists happen to be across our geography. And that in itself translated largely in significant efficiency gains that we measure around 20% year after year following the digital transformation. In addition to that, we also conducted a satisfaction survey across our pathologists. And the experience of our pathologists is that the digital workflow was a more pleasant environment in which to work. The digital workflow also translated in improved quality of the diagnosis. In other words, pathologists felt that the quality of the diagnosis they were providing was significantly better than that on the microscope. And afterwards, nobody wanted to go back to the analog workflow. In other words, once you try digital pathology, you don't want to go back to the microscope, to the analog workflow. So this can be a good summary, really, of our experience at Granada University hospitals after having transitioned from glass to full digital workflow. So let us look at the reasons as to why pathology should be modernized. Because of course we can say, well, the microscope is cheap, the microscope is efficient, the microscope works. We're hugely experienced in the use of light microscopy. So why should it be modernized? Let's look at a series of numbers, a series of reasons why pathology should be modernized. And essentially, this paper that was published some years ago takes a look at the trend in terms of the number of pathologists compared to other medical disciplines. So we can see how the numbers of anesthesiologists and radiologists basically keeps creeping up. However, the number of pathologists is actually decreasing due to retirements that do not get replaced by new trainees coming into the profession. More worryingly, what we do see is that the number of cancer specimens, certainly in the United States and Canada, keeps creeping up. So in other words, what we do have is a situation whereby we have more work to do, increasing number of cancer specimens, but a decreasing number of pathologists actually to deal with these cases, to be able to face the challenges of these oncology patients that require laborious and complex diagnosis. And, this is something that is not unique to the United States and Canada. It's something that happens in the majority of the Western world. And obviously, this report from the Royal College of Pathologists from the United Kingdom essentially, summarizes that only 3% of histopathology departments across the United Kingdom have sufficient staff to meet their clinical needs. So in other words, pathology is a profession under stress because essentially there is more work to do, more complex reports to elaborate pertaining with cancer specimens, but a decreasing number of pathologists to cope with this challenge. And essentially, that is largely the reason because a lot of what pathologists have to do consists of finding needles in haystacks. If you think about the work that pathologists do with prostatic needle biopsy diagnosis, that is largely looking for very small things that may or may not be there. So very similar to looking for needles in haystack. Something similar happens in assessment of lymph nodes in patients with breast cancer. So this could be challenging, could be time consuming, could be slow. And unfortunately, pathologists are only human beings. And that means that, we inevitably make mistakes. And I think, these papers, these pieces of evidence published in the literature try to summarize, the problems associated with prostatic core needle biopsy, especially these 3 papers here. So we know that the false negative rate of diagnosis, wrong diagnosis by pathologists doing assessment of needle biopsies in prostate can be, as high as, around 2 to 3%, according to the literature. Also, we know that a number of specimens in the pathology labs actually have complications, and that is largely due to samples that get misplaced, samples that get swapped between patients, samples that get contaminated by DNA from other samples, etc., etc., etc. So for these reasons, every help that we can get from technology to help us minimize these risks, to help us minimize these false negatives, should be embraced with open arms. Because, at the end of the day, what we want to avoid at all costs is that situation on a populational level where we come across, headlines in the press like this, where essentially, the press publicizes, the fact that, pathologists are human beings, and, we all make mistakes, and obviously, that can have, severe and very tragic consequences for patients. So technology, as we will see later on, can help us minimize this risk. And for that reason, due to the stress that we as submitted to as a profession, we should embrace the technology to help us minimize this risk and to help us minimize situations like that they see on the screen. So essentially, today, artificial intelligence has proven that we can actually reduce the number of false negative errors, particularly false negative errors committed by pathologists. And this is something that was reflected in this article that we published last year, and essentially publishes the results of a clinical trial that led to the approval of the first artificial intelligence tool in pathology that was basically a prostate algorithm. And the idea here is that the algorithm itself, in itself has value, but the most important idea is that the combination of pathologists together with artificial intelligence improve the performance of pathologists. So in other words, artificial intelligence is not here to diagnose autonomously these cases. Rather than that, but the role of technology is essentially to help pathologists do a more efficient job, do a more accurate job when it comes to diagnosing these specimens. And as we can see, when aided by the technology, pathologists made 70% fewer errors than when the pathologists are not aided by the technology. Let me give you additional examples as to the impact that the technology can also have in other areas that pathologists do day in and day out, like assessment of sentinel lymph nodes in breast cancer. So essentially, these articles, that were published many years ago. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, some of them were published more than 10 years ago, but they're still very valid today. And the idea is that we have suboptimal agreement when assessing metastases that are small, metastases that present low volume in breast cancer. And of course, this can potentially have a significant impact when it comes to assessing the end staging of patients with breast cancer. This article that was also published, more than 10 years ago, again highlights the fact that when a group of specialists reviews the nodal stage of patients with breast cancer that have been primarily diagnosed by generalists, these expert pathologists usually end up upstaging, increasing the end status of these patients. And the number of patients that suffer that is around a quarter of them. So in other words, around a quarter of patients diagnosed by general pathologists actually should have an increased end status when they're reviewed by specialists. In other words, pathologists are human beings. It's inevitable that we miss, especially small things that are challenging to detect. A small foci of cancer in needle biopsies, small micromets that are easy to miss and potentially can affect the end staging and potentially the treatment of those patients, as we see in this paper that was published, some time ago. But again, similar to what we saw earlier on in prostate, we see that when aided by the technology, pathologists can actually perform a much better job aided by artificial intelligence than were not alone. And the chameleon challenge that again was published some years ago highlights this. So essentially, when pathologists which are the group that we see here, the orange dot that we see here, when pathologists look at lymph node biopsies without the aid of technology and with time constraints, they do a job that is not less than perfect. The green dot that we see here represents a pathologist who is a breast specialist but has no time constraints, unlike the rest of the pathologists who basically had time constraint, much like we do have in clinical practice, in real world practice. But when pathologists who are specialists do not have any time constraints, they do an almost perfect job. But that is unfortunately not the case when the pathologists are under time pressure and when the pathologists are not necessarily specialists in breast pathology. The lines that we see here actually correspond with artificial intelligence tools. So the point of the matter, the point of this study is that some tools can actually do as good as a job as a pathologist who's a specialist and has no time constraint. But again, the main point here is that pathologists are not going to be replaced by technology, but rather pathologists should embrace the technology because it will help them be more efficient, more accurate, and overall to provide a better quality diagnosis than when the pathologists are not aided by this novel technology. Right, so moving on. So we've seen that, these are the reasons why we should embrace artificial intelligence. Pathology is under stress. We have less people to do more work. And, cancer diagnosis keeps getting more complex every day. So artificial intelligence is here to help us tackle this challenge. But how do we get there? If we want to implement artificial intelligence, what are the steps that we need to follow? And essentially, the first step that we need to follow would be to optimize the workflow. Because at the end of the day, digital pathology is very reliant on the quality of the histology. So once we have optimized our workflow, once we have optimized our histology, the next step is the IT integration between the laboratory information system, the LIS, and the tracking software, together with the digital pathology element. With that in mind, we can then implement digital pathology and digitize the entirety, ideally the entirety of our workload. And only then we can implement artificial intelligence. So these are the steps that we need to follow successfully. So first of all, optimizing our histology in order to be able to integrate the LIS and the IT infrastructure before we can fully implement digital pathology. And only then we can then implement artificial intelligence at a clinical scale. So what do we mean by improving the workflow? So essentially, one of the key elements, one of the key source of errors that we see in digital pathology labs is the fact that QR codes do not always get properly read by the digital pathology scanners. And that is largely the case because the labels get contaminated, get stained during the pre-analytical, during the staining process, which means that the QR code is not always visible. So we have to address that problem and we have to ensure that the QR codes are of the best possible quality. And, sometimes even may be necessary to replace the printers to make sure that the QR codes are of the top quality, because at the end of the day, these are the unique identifiers for each slide. So whenever the slide obtains a digital replica of that slide, it will be assigned to the right patient and to the right case. And for that reason, the QR code is essential. More problems that we do see essentially pertain, how the slides are prepared. So that slide that we see here with the overhanging cover slipper, in the microscope, this is not a big problem because, in the microscope, this overhanging glass bit here and there will not create any major problems. But if we were to put this slide on the digital pathology scanner, the scanner may have problems digitizing this slide because the slides need to be really, really well prepared. The cover slips need to be really well aligned with the main glass in order to not interfere with the mechanical elements of the scanner. Things like bubbles in the glass slide, again, in the microscope, this is relatively straightforward to navigate, but the digital pathology scanners do not have that luxury. And that means that this can lead to artifacts that may render, the slide not legible by the pathologist. Things like this, obviously for a pathologist, who is delivered this slide, it's very easy to just separate these two slides into the individual ones. But if we put this into digital pathology scanner, this could potentially jam the scanner. So again, we need to be really, really cognizant that these slides obviously are not suitable to be put into a scanner, and that can potentially create significant problems and even jam the scanner. Another typical problem is essentially, mounting media, glue, basically oozing on the sides of the slides. Again, this is very easy to navigate with a microscope, but if we put this slide inside a scanner, this can potentially create problems. And I can tell you that, in our institution, we definitely had problems with this kind of slides. So one of the cover slippers actually produced significant amounts of glue. And whenever we put these slides into the scanner, that broke the scanner a number of times. And that essentially triggered panic emergency visits from the technicians from the scanning manufacturer company to our lab in order to do a full cleanup of the scanner, et cetera, which means that the scanner had to be, in downtime for repairs. And obviously that is what you want to avoid at all costs if you're digitizing your slides every day, single day in and day out. So very important that the slides are nice and dry, rid of any excess of mounting media, and can be put into the scanner safely without creating any major problems. So at the end of the day, the digital workflow largely requires a digital pathology scanner whose mission at the end of the day is to obtain a digital twin, a digital replica of the glass slide. So the glass slide is, for the most part, prepared the same way that it's always been prepared, with the exception that we just discussed. And the job of the scanner is to create this digital twin, this digital replica. In that sequence, the QR code is paramount. And that is the reasons why we discussed earlier that having good quality QR codes is essential if we want to digitize large number of our glass slides. On the other end of the spectrum, what we do see is the viewer. And essentially the viewer, what it does is to replace the pathologist. However, the job of the viewer is basically to replace the microscope, but is not to organize the workflow. Because essentially the role of organizing the workflow corresponds to the laboratory information system. And this is why the integration between all of these elements is paramount. Whenever a slide gets digitized, the LIS gets triggered by the QR code. And essentially, that new digital image that has been created has to be assigned to the right patient and to the right case. And that is a function of the LIS. Whenever the pathologist requests new techniques on a certain case, like you order immunostains, you order levels, you order additional techniques, that information goes back to the LIS, which in return should be feedback to the digital pathology system, waiting for these new techniques to be created. In other words, the interaction between these three elements is key in a digital pathology element. So this is why all of these elements between the IT infrastructure and the pre-analytical need to come together to facilitate the digital viewing of the images and the eventual suppression of the analog workflow and substitution for the digital workflow. Right, challenges that we may encounter in this process. So obviously the main challenge that we have discussed is the QR code. They have to be of the top quality for the reasons that we mentioned. So essentially, it is imperative that the QR codes are of the maximal possible quality in order to minimize this kind of errors. Sometimes changing the printers may be required, and certainly in some institutions that I have worked with, they needed to change the printers in order to minimize the risk of the QR codes not being ideal. Also, the question of the cover slips needs to be addressed because, again, it's important that the cover slips perfectly aligned with the main glass slide in order to minimize the risk of them interfering with the mechanical elements of the scanner. And certainly in a number of institutions that I work with, we have strongly suggested that perhaps film cover slipping should be employed because at the end of the day, film cover slips, they always align perfectly well with the glass slide. They dry up fairly quickly. They do not leave any residue in terms of glue, etc. They get dry very quickly and are suitable to be put in the scanner very quickly. Another element to bear in mind is the batch versus continuous workflow. So let me explain to you what I mean by that. So in most pathology labs around the world, we follow a batch approach. What we mean by that is that a large number of glass slides is produced at once, and those glass slides get put into the scanner to be scanned one at a time. The problem here is that the digital pathology scanners can only read a single glass slide at a time. So essentially, the scanning process creates a huge bottleneck here, where all of the slides get put in the queue, waiting for them to be digitized one slide at a time. But the problem is that the scanner sits unused for long periods of time, waiting for this very large batch of glass slides to come to the digital pathology scanner. Can we find an alternative to this approach? Is there a better alternative to this? And the answer is basically to find a continuous workflow. By continuous workflow, but what we mean by that is that small batches get sent to the scanner time after time. So the scanner, instead of being sitting and used, gets actually used around the clock. So the scanner is almost always scanning. So first batch first, then the second batch next, and then the third batch next. So in other words, we migrate from a batch approach where the scanner is basically not being used, and all of a sudden a large batch of slides gets delivered, as opposed to a situation whereby the scanner is always continuously in use, thanks to small batches that get delivered almost constantly. So definitely, whenever possible, a continuous workflow is a much better alternative because it maximizes the amount of scanning time that we can put to our scanner. Obviously, the alternative to this would be to buy more scanners, but of course, buying scanners is expensive, and sometimes it makes sense to opt for a continuous workflow approach. Another problem that we face, fairly frequently is the integration with the LIS. So we discussed earlier that, the integration between the IT infrastructure is paramount. And the reason for that is that we need to be able to find that, the LIS system is always in charge of the workflow. And this is what we call an LIS-centric versus an image-centric approach. So the reason for that is that the LIS is always like the conductor in the orchestra. So whenever we request an additional staying in a case, the LIS is notified, and this notification gets feedback to the digital pathology scanner, to the digital pathology element. Another reason is that the case status is essentially a function of the LIS. And this is important because, again, whenever I update a case because I request additional stains, I do that on the LIS, and this has to be reflected on the digital pathology platform. So again, it's the bilateral interaction between the LIS and the digital pathology platform which actually facilitates the application of the continuous workflow in pathology. Right, so those are the foundations for digital pathology. We discussed that the workflow needs to be modified. We discussed also that the IT infrastructure needs to be bilaterally in connection with each other, so the case status can be basically interchanged for all the slides that get digitized. But once we achieve full digital pathology, what is it that pathologists like about digital pathology? And the first thing that pathologists like about digital pathology is the quality of the images at low power. So let's imagine that we're reviewing this fragment of tissue on the microscope. So usually the minimum possible power that you can get on your microscope is 2.5x. However, on the digital pathology scanner, you can go as low as 0.5x, which permits you to visualize all of the tissue present on the preparation at once. So instead of having to navigate with a microscope up and down, trying to visualize the entire piece of tissue present on the slide, at low power on a digital pathology, you can see at a glance the regions of interest where you want to focus your attention, but also the regions where you don't need to spend that much time because there are no obvious morphological areas that warrant an additional review. So this is one of the key elements why pathologists prefer the digital workflow. Essentially, it's the quality of the low power images. And at the end of the day, as pathologists, we spend the immense majority of our time looking at slides at low power. So this is certainly an area where digital pathology does better than the microscope. Another aspect is obviously measuring tumor, measuring the distance to margins, measuring tumor thickness, etc., etc., etc. So imagine that we want to measure a melanoma, for instance. Obviously, this is how things are done around the world today. So essentially, we put a school ruler on the microscope stage, we look through the binocular, and this is what we see. We see our lesion there, and then we estimate, we do our best with the tools that we have to assess, the tumor thickness and to assess, the distance to margins, etc., etc., etc. How is this done in a digital workflow? So obviously in a digital workflow, you have digital tools that are definitely more accurate, more elegant, more precise when it comes to performing this task. So obviously this is another, the availability of digital tools is definitely very attractive to pathologists because essentially, it results at the end of the day in greater quality and more efficient workflow when it comes to, to perform these tasks. Again, things like perhaps, assessing the tumoral burden in a prostatic core needle biopsy, you can certainly do that using the digital tools, although of course, artificial intelligence can provide to you automatically all of these elements like, total quantification of the overall invasive carcinoma burden on that core, as well as the carcinoma length, in addition to a breakdown of the different Gleason patterns present on that score. And of course, the idea is that this information would be interchanged and extracted to your LIS. So whenever the pathologist opens up the case on the LIS, all of this information is already written there in the report. And that greatly facilitates the job of the pathologist. So essentially, the job of the pathologist is just to visualize what the AI is telling me. If I agree with that, just validate, sign off the case, and off to the next case. So obviously, that facilitates, safety, accuracy, and of course, efficiency, because essentially, it provides the majority of the legwork that the pathologist would have to do otherwise themselves. Another advantage of the digital workflow is that, well, if that is, the number of slides produced by a lab in a typical day, and you get a call from a clinician asking you about a certain patient, well, you're going to have to spend some time going through that pile of cases, looking for the particular case, the particular slide that interests you in order to address the clinician who's actually on the other end of the phone. So what you do more often than not is, pick up the phone and tell the clinician, listen, can I ring you back in half an hour? And what you do is spend the next half an hour looking for that particular case on that pile of glass slides. With a digital workflow, however, what you do is actually you log into your digital pathology system, you go into your search field that you can see here, you type the patient details, and the patient magically appears in front of you. So therefore, you can address the clinician queries pretty much on the fly and without wasting time looking for glass slides that may or may not appear on a timely manner. So a summary of the different advantages essentially is the good quality of low power images, which at a glance permits the pathologist to visualize the entirety of the lesion, the availability of different digital pathology tools that permits measuring tumor thickness, distance to margins, etc., etc. Another very cool tool is essentially the ability to split your screen in different quadrants, so you can visualize the H&E and a different of other techniques all at once, so you can see how these techniques correlate in different regions of the same slide. Importantly, once your workflow is 100% digital, that means that a series of workflows in the analog paradigm become redundant, which means that essentially no case sorting and distribution is needed. In other words, every day, say your typical pathology lab, for argument's sake, produces around 1,000 slides every day. And that 1,000 slides have to be put in order, have to be collated by the technicians, have to be matched with the request forms, and have to be handed to the pathologist. And that is done by persons, by technicians all around the world, which spend a significant amount of hours every single day doing that. With digital pathology, that process takes place automatically, which means that the technicians no longer have to waste time doing case assembly and distribution. But of course, you have to be 100% digital to achieve that. But obviously, this is one of the benefits of digital pathology. So the benefits is not just for pathologists, but also reflects in other areas of the lab, including how technicians work. And of course, the counterbalance to that is that technicians would have to operate the scanners. But today, the clinical grade scanners essentially do not require more than one full-time equivalent, more than one person to actually operate, because essentially there are scanners designed to be high throughput, which essentially means that they are capable of digitize large volumes of of slides with relatively little human interaction. So again, the advantages of digital pathology not only pertain to pathologists, but also across other functions in the lab. And again, the vision is that artificial intelligence will help pathologists largely identify the areas of tumor and also automate a significant part of the work that otherwise would be tedious and time-consuming. I particularly like this tweet, which was written by Lorna Cottrell, who is a Scottish pathologist. And it was written 5 years ago, but essentially it relates to a situation that most of us can relate as pathologists. And she says, cannot wait for digital pathology because I wouldn't have just spent 40 minutes tearing my office apart looking for a glass slide, which was actually sitting on my microscope. In other words, glass slides get lost all the time. Glass slides get broken. Glass slides get misplaced, and we spend an incredible amount of time looking for glass slides that may or may not be there. But of course, once you go fully digital, this problem becomes a thing of the past, and this greatly adds to your working experience and greatly adds to your efficiency as a pathologist. And as I mentioned earlier, these efficiency gains not only materialize to pathologists, but also to technicians, because again, if your lab produces 1,000 slides every day, they have to be put in order, they have to be collated. But of course, once you have a digital pathology scanners, the digital images automatically, thanks to the interaction with LIS, with IT infrastructure, get sent straight away to the right pathologist, regardless of whether this pathologist happens to be at home, in the hospital, or in a distant remote site. It doesn't matter anymore. So all of this has a significant impact on the operations of the lab overall. And the question is, right, so how can we measure that impact? And is there a number of hours that we can estimate saving when a pathology lab has gone fully digital? And essentially this paper that was published by Lapong in the Netherlands some time ago estimates that the overall number of hours per day saved across the entire lab, not just by the pathologist, but also by technical staff and secretarial and clerical staff, amounts overall to 19 hours per day saved by just working digitally. So again, the benefits do not just encompass the pathologist, but also, all the associated professions across the lab. When it comes to reading times, some pathologists feel a bit, anxious because they say, well, I'm very quick with my microscope. Am I going to be as quick reading digitally? And this paper, which was published, several years ago, actually reports 10% shorter reading times in digital compared to the microscope. So in other words, pathologists can definitely read cases quicker when reading cases digitally. And this evidence was actually supported again by this paper, which was published by Lapon again, another, the same lab from the Netherlands, was published earlier this year, saying that on average, there's a reduction in reading times of around 12% when the pathologists read their cases on a digital workflow. So that is the things that pathologists normally like about going digital. So the workflow is more efficient, the workflow is quicker, you don't waste time looking for slides, measuring tumors, distance to margins, etc., is quicker and more efficient, etc., etc. But again, I'm not here to tell you, the rosy legend. I'm also here to talk about, things that pathologists do not like about digital pathology, because nothing in life is perfect, and digital pathology is no exception. Right. So, what things do pathologists do not like about digital pathology? So, the first thing is that we mentioned that image at low power look better on digital compared to the microscope, but the opposite is also true to high power images. In other words, high power images in digital have some level of pixelation that is not present on the optical microscope. And the reason for that is that, these images are normally scanned at 40x, which means that when we go beyond 40x, we are digitally zooming into the image. And we know what happens there, that pixelation occurs. In other words, there is the same number of pixels created where we just blow in those pixels up, trying to recreate higher magnification than that at which the image was originally acquired. So essentially, pixelation occurs at very high powers. An example of that would be, in gastric biopsies, for instance, finding Helicobacter can be a bit challenging. I mean, we can still see the bacteria, we still see it there, but certainly it's not as clear, it's not as sharp as it would be on the microscope. So again, low power images, much better on digital, but high power images, still better on the microscope. Another situation is when looking for very small things, bacteria, as we just saw, but also mitosis, like we see here. Perhaps you may want to, see that image with greater clarity to discern whether that's going to be a mitosis or an apoptotic body. For the most part, mitosis are fairly clear, but again, the images are definitely not as sharp as they would be on the microscope. So of course, every time that we require to go above 40x, we're going to incur in some degree of digital magnification, which means that the pixels will start to get blurry if we go beyond 40x. So that is the trade-off. Better quality in low power images in digital, but not so good images as on the microscope when we go high power. But the question is, as pathologists, we probably spend the majority of our time looking at low power. So on the whole, probably the balance actually is beneficial for pathologists, because essentially we spend the majority of our time at 5x, 20x, 5, 10, 20x, rather than at very high power. Another problem is mentality, is psychology. And essentially, we refer to the fact that, some pathologists, usually the senior, not always, but typically the more senior pathologists, well, they've been using the microscope for decades. They're very confident in their diagnosis. They're very quick with the microscope, but perhaps they're not so quick with technology, not so quick in a digital environment or using a computer or using even, the mobile phone. So, certainly, these pathologies have to be managed with care and may have some difficulties that we have to address on an individual basis. When we were doing the digital transformation in Granada, in Spain, we had one of senior pathologists whose name was Miguel. And Miguel, was a very good pathologist, incredibly talented, very, very good guy, very good person, extremely good colleague. But he was very afraid of digital pathology, and he did not like the idea of going digital. So Miguel, back in those days, he was like, Juan, I like the idea of going digital, but I'd rather stay with my microscope. So can you not leave me on my microscope until I retire and spare me the pain and suffering of having to, embrace the digital pathology workflow, which is something that I don't look forward to. Long story short is that Miguel was persuaded to try digital pathology. So he tried it, but he did not like it. And he did not like it because the image that he saw on the digital pathology screen, according to him, was very different to what he saw on the microscope. So he hated digital pathology. But Miguel told me one day, Juan, you know what? I'm due for an eye test. I have to go to the optician. So I'll go to the optician and I'll get back to you. So Miguel, who hated digital pathology, went to the optician. He got new glasses, new lenses. And this is Miguel a few days later, after trying his new glasses on the digital pathology environment. In other words, Miguel did not like digital pathology because he had a visual problem that had not been corrected. Whenever he had that visual problem corrected with the adequate glasses, he was very comfortable using digital pathology. The images that he saw on the screen were equivalent to those that he saw on the microscope. So in other words, some pathologists will have some mental barriers that need to be overcome. Some of them also would have physical barriers that need to be addressed. Miguel essentially needed a visit to the optician to get his vision tested and corrected. And essentially Miguel retired being a happy digital pathologist. And, he loved digital pathology and he never really touched a microscope again, in the short few years that he had until retirement. And in fact, you can probably see his microscope here at the bottom of the screen. The microscope stage has a post-it note on it, which means that he really didn't use the microscope anymore after having gone digital. But of course, there were a series of mental barriers, mental and physicals, that had to be addressed before Miguel could actually use digital pathology proficiently. So on the whole, is it worth it? Going digital is necessarily not cheap, involves a series of efforts, involves a series of challenges that have to be addressed in a multidisciplinary team approach. Is it worth it? So essentially, to address that question, we did an efficiency analysis to try and measure the productivity and the efficiency of pathologists and compare that to the microscope workflow years after having gone digital. So essentially, in the year 2015, we had 24 pathologists who dealt with this number of cases, which means that on average, each pathologist dealt with this number of cases per year. You have to bear in mind that this is actually cases that exclude cytology. So cytology was not digitized, but everything that was digitized, so every case, every histopathology case was actually digitized. And essentially on the baseline, on the microscope, before digitization, that was the number of cases per pathologist. What we do see is that year after year, the number of cases per pathologist actually increased, thanks largely to the digital transformation. And we can see how this number, this efficiency of pathologists increased 15% the first year, 20% the second year, 26% the following year. So in other words, since digital transformation, on average, the productivity, the efficiency of pathologists actually jumped by 20% following the digital transformation and comparing workloads with the analog workflow. In addition to that, we conducted a survey across our pathologists, basically to gauge the level of satisfaction with the digital pathology. Did they like it? Did they hate it? So we wanted to know that. And we essentially conducted an anonymous survey to try and gauge, the level of satisfaction with digital pathology. So we asked the pathologists the first question, which was, how do you think your efficiency has changed following the digital pathology transformation? And essentially, pathologists reported on average 20% increase in efficiency, which is very similar to the numbers that we just discussed a minute ago. The second thing, how do you think digital pathology has affected the quality of your diagnosis? And essentially, almost 80% of all the pathologists felt that the quality of the diagnosis was better than with the microscope, for the reasons that we have discussed. Better tracking throughout the pre-analytical, better preparation of the slides during the pre-analytical, availability of measuring tools that probably are more accurate than the analog tools, etc., etc. So for all of these reasons, the perception was that the quality of the diagnosis was better than that on the microscope. With regards to home reporting, obviously, we did the digital transformation before the COVID pandemic. So back in those days, before the pandemic, about a quarter of the pathologists routinely signed out cases from home. But obviously, during the pandemic, 100% of the pathologists actually migrated to a home-based workflow with absolutely no problems, because obviously the infrastructure had been there, had been working forever, since ages, basically. And essentially, that the number of pathologists routinely reporting from home definitely jumped during the pandemic, but also after the pandemic. And the final question, which was the million-dollar question, is essentially, after trying digital pathology, would you rather stay digital or would you go back to the microscope? And essentially, 100% of the pathologists prefer digital to the microscope. So essentially, no one of them wanted to touch a microscope again. And on the whole, I think this survey summarizes fairly well what's in it for pathologists. What are pathologists, achieving by transforming the practice from analog to digital? So essentially, it's better efficiency, better quality of diagnosis, more flexibility in terms of home reporting, and strong preference to continue working in a digital environment. Right, so to start wrapping up my talk today, I'd just like to briefly summarize the points that we touch upon. So as we've seen, pathology is a discipline under strain, because essentially we have more cancer cases, but diminishing number of pathologists to cope with these increasing workloads. The technology that we use today, which is the microscope, has really not changed in 200 years. And that puts limitations on how well we find needles in haystacks, how well we cope with time pressure, how well we cope with the increasing demands that oncology diagnosis actually places upon the pathologist. So it's time that we definitely start embracing new technology that will open up new avenues of efficiency, quality, and safety for our patients. In addition to that, digital pathology and artificial intelligence are showing evidence of benefit, in the papers that we discussed earlier on during my presentation, but also importantly, improve patient safety. we do better for our patients. We reduce the number of errors with the new technology. So for all of these reasons, I think the technology should be embraced with open arms by pathologists. In addition, we've seen how a series of steps have to be followed, starting with optimizing your workflow, integrating your IT infrastructure, your LIS, and only when this foundation is in place, we can start implementing digital pathology, which in itself is a prerequisite to implementing artificial intelligence in the routine workflow. So as we've seen, the slide preparation is essential. The LIS interaction is another key piece, and digital pathology in itself becomes the foundation of artificial intelligence. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention today. And if time permits, I would be very glad to take any questions, and indeed looking forward to the discussion. So thanks very much again. And yeah, looking forward to your questions.
Yes, thank you, Juan. Great talk. So amazing. There are some questions. I will introduce them to you. Can we take your email? First question. We can share. It's okay for you. And Ibrahim Kulaç asks, would you confidently claim that reading times are shorter for every subspecialty, or you think there would be differences? Would really like to hear your opinion, experience on this.
Yeah, can we say that every single pathologist would be 20% more efficient? Well, not really. Some pathologists would be 30% more efficient. Some of them may be 5% slower. That it's very dependent on individual factors, of course. But on average, what we can reasonably expect is that the efficiency will go up. Does that mean that every case that I look digitally will be more quick than on the microscope? Not necessarily, but on the whole, the majority of the cases that you review digitally will be more efficient. That is what we can certainly ascertain. If we look at some of the evidence that I shared earlier, certainly not every case is quicker on digital compared to the microscope, but on the whole, the majority of cases are definitely quicker, by about 10% quicker, just by reading them digitally. But in addition to that, there is a series of advantages. Advantages like, you probably are quicker taking measurements. You don't waste time looking for slides. You don't waste time matching your immunos with a corresponding case, which is something that you do as a pathologist every single day of your career. Every day of your career, you get delivered a slide tray with immunostains, and you have to put it in order. I mean, if you have a fellow, great, but not everyone has the luxury of having a fellow. So somebody has to do that. So the point of the matter is that all of that can be done just as well by the digital pathology workflow. So these little things add up and make you a more efficient pathologist. So it's just the reading times that for the majority of cases will be quicker, but also things like preparing for tumor boards, teaching your juniors, your residents, not wasting time looking for slides, etc., etc. All of these add up and make you a more efficient pathologist.
The question is about the subspecialties, Juan. Do you want to say something for the subspecialties? In our routine, for example, in the endoscopic biopsies, you also mentioned about HP bacteria at high magnification. We had problem with endoscopic biopsies. And for example, we didn't use Giemsa stain for HP before digital. But after the digitalization of the endoscopic biopsies, we started to use Giemsa stain for HP. Like this, for which subspecialties did you have problems, or which solutions did you find?
Yeah, so finding bacteria is definitely more challenging in digital pathology for the reasons that you mentioned. One thing that, in my opinion, works really well is instead of doing Giemsa, perhaps considering doing a silver stain like Worthing Starry. And the reason for that is that Worthing Starry is being a silver stain provides greater contrast. So the bacteria are easier to find than on the Giemsa. The problem is that digital pathology scanners rely on contrast to digitize the slides. And for this reason, the Giemsa, in my opinion, is not the ideal stain for finding bacteria, whereas the Wharton starry that actually provides high contrast, it's definitely much preferable, in my opinion, to find Helicobacter in gastric biopsies. So definitely, there are a number of little tricks of the trade that you learn with experience, and perhaps preferring Wharton starry stain for stomach biopsies as opposed to GIMSA, maybe something worth trying, and see what your experience is there. But I think it's definitely worth to go. Yeah.
What about your experience in hematopathology, Juan, at your center? In lymph node biopsy, for example, in the diagnosis of lymphomas?
Yeah, so in that sense, one thing that is quite, welcome by pathologists is the ability to essentially split your screen in 4 different quadrants. And in one quadrant, you can have your H&E, and in the other 3 quadrants, you can have CD3, CD5, CD20, whatever markers you want to have. And essentially viewing the immunomarker expression in the different regions of the lymph node and refer that with the H&E is actually quite useful, really. So that is something that hematopathologists actually love in reality, because it makes your life a lot easier, visualizing different expressions all at once, all at the same time. In the microscope, the way that it's done is that you try to not forget the region of interest while you quickly swap slides, trying to find the CD that you want to compare with very quickly before you forget the region of interest. In a digital workflow, this is more efficient because essentially you overlay or you compare the different techniques together, and your attention gets to the right point all the time, which more ease and more efficiently. So yeah.
Your answer was different than I expected, because big resistance was at the hematopathology side. I will share your experience that it is better because big magnification and I used the microscope microtune so much,
Right.
so not suitable for hematopathology was one of the feedbacks I get, and I had a little resistance at digitalization, right. But one of the feedbacks was like that. Thank you. Another from our team, Mehtat Ünlü. Thank you very much for the visionary presentation. I have been working entirely digitally for the last year from home. I validated with 60 cases, but it took me about 5 months to feel completely comfortable. And I checked myself with a microscope for 3 to 4 months. In some cases, I feel really safe right now after 1 year. I have 2 questions about validation. 1, what are your qualitative and quantitative recommendations for the transition process? 2, is there a need for a legal regulation or certification for validation?
So essentially, I would say that both questions could be answered really by the existing recommendations from the College of American Pathologists, which essentially require that a validation process is performed before the adoption of digital pathology for scale. So essentially, the CAP recommends that at least 60 cases that were diagnosed primarily on the microscope get reviewed again on a digital format to try to quantify the number of discrepancies, of diagnostic discrepancies. And that should definitely be, the recommendation when starting to go digital. Does that mean that with 60 cases, you're going to be confident? Depends. Some people feel confident with even fewer cases. Some people require more cases. I think we should differentiate here between, validation, which is making sure that diagnostic discrepancies are reasonable and are kept under control. And a different thing is actually training. In other words, because again, humans are different. Some people feel more confident, sooner than others, whereas some other people need, greater exposure to different things before they start feeling more confident. So when it comes to validation, certainly CAP provides, useful guidelines, but we shouldn't be afraid to actually train in greater volumes until we feel sufficiently confident.
Okay. Do you want to say something about the legal regulation or certification for validation?
So in principle, at the moment, there is nothing in that regard. The only requirement really is the validation. when implementing digital pathology. So as long as you follow the CAP guidelines and document, the number of discrepancies, you should be okay. But so far, there are no other legal requirements prior to implementing that. In the United States, you had to have a clear certification, actually, if you wanted to sign out cases from home. But since the COVID pandemic, this has been an exception that basically has been prolonged today. So certainly there are no further regulations other than the CAP validation when it comes to implementing digital pathology for routine diagnosis.
Yes, as every new thing, time is needed for the regulations and the standardization, I think. Another question, Juan Urhan asks, can you elaborate on the FDA approval process for your AI solutions?
Yep, so
the topic of another speech, maybe, huh?
it's definitely the topic for another session. But essentially, the FDA was there were a series of elements here. The first element is that the AI is not supposed to be used autonomously. The AI is supposed to be used in conjunction as an adjunct to a pathologist. So that is the first element. The second element is how this information is presented to the pathologist. So first of all, the pathologist is supposed to look at the slide, perform their assessment, activate the AI, and then contrast their diagnosis with that proposed by the AI. The reason for that is that sometimes pathologists miss small foci of tumor that get totally overlooked. So the idea is that I reach my diagnosis, activate the AI, and then corroborate my diagnosis with that proposed by the AI. So, but remember, the AI is not gospel, is not the word of God. It's basically another touch point of information. It's just an adjunct. And just like, no different to an immunostain. Sometimes, we reach a provisional diagnosis, request the immunostains, and some of the immunos do not match our preferred diagnosis. So what we do is that we put everything into context and we reach a preferred diagnosis for the situation that we are facing. Artificial intelligence should be no different in that regard. So that is the second point, that artificial intelligence is an adjunct to the pathologist. The third element is that the AI has to generalize very well. And by generalization, what we mean is that in machine learning terms, is that it's robust to domain shifts. In other words, when you train AI, you use a series of data. When you test that AI in data that are similar to that in which was trained, the expectation is that the performance will be similar. What happens, however, when you expose the AI to data that are very dissimilar, very different to those in which it was trained? How robust is it? By that, what we mean is, data pertaining to patient variables like age, gender, race, etc., pre-analytical factors, staining, fixation times, section thickness, etc., and also the user variables like, does AI affect pathologists with more experience more or less than pathologists with less experience? So, all of these variables basically are covered under the term, generalizability. How well does the AI actually generalize in different patients, different populations, different pre-analyticals, and different users? So these were the three main pillars upon which, the FDA examined AI performance prior to providing authorization.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Another question from Ceren Boyacı. Do pathologists at your clinic have the same experience with resection specimens as they have with biopsies on the digital pathology workflow?
Yes, because essentially every single case was digitized from 2016, every single one, including biopsies, resections, and of course, it's a public healthcare system, which means that we have to cover all sorts, including biopsies, including large resections, all medical specialties, including, from head and neck to soft tissue, absolutely everything, pediatric pathology, medical kidney, absolutely everything. And everything was digitized. And, very, very, very few slides were still reviewed under the microscope. So certainly, reviewing every case digital is indeed possible, more than possible, and it's highly recommended.
Yes, thank you. Another question from Kerem Kayhan. Ambitious studies on bright field are being all over the world, and they are successful. Besides, how do you approach immunofluorescent cases and also especially virtual staining 3D models?
Yeah, so essentially, 3D models is something that, still today is more in the realm of experimental pathology, but not really seeing in routine practice. If what we mean by 3D model is actually having a Z axis, so in other words, we have the X-axis, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis, which at the end of the day is what pathologists have with the micrometers. We can actually play with the different thickness of the preparation, if we will. This is something that most routine digital pathology scanners do not have today. But it is a matter of time before we have Z-axis. So that is as far as three-dimensional pathology is involved. But certainly beyond that seems to be outside the routine clinical use at this point in time.
Thank you, Juan. Another question from one of my old friends, Ülgen. Do you have any experience about application of AI in practice of a pathology residency education program?
Yeah, that is a great question because there is two schools of thought here. One is that what happens with pilots when they get trained in flight school? They don't start flying with autopilot when they are learning, right? Instead, what they do is that they have to learn with a small airplane, and eventually they graduate into a bigger airplane, more complex, that eventually has autopilot amongst many other things. Is that how we want to train our residents? Do we want our residents to feel comfortable on a microscope without using any aids? In my opinion, that's probably the right way to do it. However, also there is great value in teaching residents to use artificial intelligence, and this should be incorporated into the training syllabus early, because at the end of the day, this is something that is happening today. And obviously, in an ideal world, we want to train our residents to be able to use artificial intelligence, as is intended, as an adjunct to the pathologist, to be able to make a judicious use of the outputs that the AI is giving us, and to be able to put into context whatever the AI is telling us. So all of this has to be incorporated into the training syllabus. But of course, there is no substitute for, training our residents to use the microscope with proficiency and with confidence.
Okay. One question is, if you are educated with AI in residency, will the cutoffs be changed, or will what we are used to, maybe a little change will happen with AI, but change is the only thing that doesn't change, I think.
Yes, change is the only constant for sure. In my opinion, you can certainly, expose the residents to more cases with artificial intelligence than without, because, how do you explain what Gleason 3 and Gleason 4 is unless you have an attending pointing out specific areas on every glass slide? We're all humans and we all have time constraints. We're all under pressure. So, the faculty can only spend so much time pointing out to what is a region of Gleason 3 in this slide. But the AI does not have those constraints. So, perhaps residents can take, some homework at home at night, activate the AI, look at some slides and see, oh, right, this is what is meant by Gleason 3. This is what it's meant by Gleason 4. This is actually an area of Gleason 5 that the AI is highlighting for me. So it will facilitate exposing residents to greater amounts of cases without needing to be, actually supervised constantly by the attendant. Of course, the attendant will have to provide supervision, but, in order to memorize certain patterns, AI can be very, very helpful. Perhaps, assessing lymph nodes. Sometimes it's challenging to find the micromet, but the AI can do that, in a fraction of a second. So these little challenges can be proposed to residents as part of the training. And I think, it make it more enjoyable and quite useful learning experience, in my opinion.
With AI and digital pathology, pathology became more amazing for the young pathologists, and they they like it more. They like pathology more with AI. It's a good point of that, I think.
Yes, because you don't have to be pestering anyone to show you what Gleason 5 looks like, right? You just basically open up a case, click a button, and that is you're not bothering your attending, if you will. And I guess some trainees are very conscious of time pressures that everyone is under, and they don't want to put more burden. So perhaps having AI as an additional resource, I think is quite welcome by the trainees. So yeah, totally share your point there.
Also for joystick children, AI is so good.
Yeah, agree.
Yes. Another question from our honoring pathologist, Aydın Sağ. Thanks for your comprehensive and eye-opening talk. May I learn your impression of the future of digital transformation? I will go on one by one, Juan. First is this. Future of digital transformation. What do you think?
So I think, we talk about digital pathology today. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're just going to call it pathology. Few years ago, we talk about mobile phones. Today, we don't say mobile phones. Today, we just say our phone, right? Where is my phone, right? I've just got a phone call. We don't talk about mobile phones anymore for the most part. And I think something similar is going to happen to digital pathology, perhaps in a similar timeline. So from digital pathology, we're going to go to just pathology. In other words, digital pathology should become mainstream within the next few years, because we know it works, and there's early adopters, in the 5 continents, basically proving that it's doable, that it's possible, and that you can do it, and you're gonna survive, right? And not only that, but also you're gonna thrive. Your colleagues are gonna thank you. Because it's a more flexible, it's a preferred alternative to the microscope. You're no longer bound to show up to the hospital, show up to the laboratory, to pay homage to the temple of pathology. You can work from home. If you have small kids, a young family, it provides additional flexibility. So for all of these reasons, your colleagues are going to be thankful that you embark in this transformation journey, and therefore digital pathology will become pathology, just mainstream pathology. That is my vision for the future.
Okay. The next question, what are the limits of AI? My understanding is that AI will not substitute manpower, namely pathologists, but will be used extensively by whom? Those who welcome the concept of digital transformation.
Yeah, I think that's largely accurate. So again, this is the topic for another talk in the future. But as we mentioned earlier, AI is meant to be an assistant to the pathologist, an adjunct to the pathologist, no different to an immunostain. Of course, it's a sophisticated, adjunct, if you will, but it has to be put into context, because nothing is perfect in life, and AI is no exception. So autonomous AI is still not in the cards for many decades. So we shouldn't be afraid of losing our jobs anytime soon. Of course, I guess
to lose one.
but I guess
we get rid of our pains, back pains, and others.
Right. Yeah. So no, but that is a great point, because the repetitive menial tasks like counting mitosis, quantifying Ki-67, finding micromets in a lymph node, AI can do that much better for you. One thing that AI cannot do is put things into context, and this is something that we, as the human brain, does very well. So we take the salient elements of morphology, immunohistochemistry, quantification, molecular. We put all of that into context, and we put that in our reports. This is something that we do incredibly well, but the machine cannot do that yet. But this is the reason why we're not going to be left unemployed by the technology anytime soon.
Yes, a good assistant is good.
Right.
Last one, could this technique be complied with molecular biomarkers? If so, how this will be achieved?
Yeah, that is a great question, because at the end of the day, we have increasing evidence that certain mutations correspond to a certain phenotype. In other words, the mutational status of a cell will actually result in a phenotype that can be detected by the AI. Not all mutations result in that phenotypical change that can be detected, but some of them are. And, case in point is probably, MSI and HER2. We know that these two mutations can actually be detected by AI. But at the end of the day, what AI is looking at is changes in phenotype, which at the end of the day is what you want if you think about it. Because when you treat these patients with immunotherapy, what you're treating is the phenotype. You don't treat the underlying mutation. What you do treat is the phenotype. The phenotypical alteration is what responds to treatment. In other words, this is a long, convoluted way of saying that essentially Rudolf Virchow said it 150 years ago, that no matter how you slice it and dice it, you will always come back to the cell. You will always come back to morphology. And this is what we're seeing again, that there is a lot of information in the humble H&E slide that can be extracted thanks to artificial intelligence. This mutational status that obeys, that creates a certain phenotype, many times can be detected by artificial intelligence. And I think that's incredibly exciting because we're going full circle from, from morphology to molecular back to morphology again.
Yes. Thank you. AI will be so amazing to talk again with you, Juan. Yeah, we can share that we will have another session about AI, but the questions show that everyone waits for AI. Another question from Murat Mirza Tufan. You said that slide barcodes are very important for slide scanning. How did you handle this problem? I think only laser slide printers can meet this stability 100%. How did you achieve this standard here?
So there are no hard and fast rules. My advice would, once you get a digital pathology scanner, test it and test it with your existing barcodes. See how many error rates you get. Is that error rate something that you can manage? Perhaps, if the error rate that you find is maybe 5 in 100, that means that if you do, 1,000 slides every day, you're going to have 50 slides that are going to end up in limbo because they could not trigger the interchange of information. Is that something you can manage? Because if it is something you can manage, then probably you don't need to do anything else than that. If the error rate, however, is 20%, which means that you're going to end up with 200 slides every day then being sent to limbo, then you probably need to do something about it. So what can you do there? Well, laser printers is definitely a solution, but they're very expensive. Nothing in life is perfect. There's always a trade-off. And, if you want to have perfect barcodes, you're probably going to end up with a very expensive printer. But there are alternatives like, right, how about if we try increasing the contrast setting in our printer? Will that result in fewer errors? What if we try changing the actual labels for those labels that have a plastic cover? Will those labels result in fewer errors? If everything else fails, then probably you can start thinking about testing with different printers. Ultimately, the laser printer is probably the best solution because it etches on the slide itself, on the glass, which is very resistant, is very good quality, but it's expensive, right? So again, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a matter of trial and error many times until you find an error rate that you feel comfortable with.
I think we changed twice or 3 times the barcode readers to manage the reading of the QR codes.
Right.
Try and see.
Exactly.
I think our experience is like that also.
It may be that the barcodes quality is already very good, and you end up with an error rate of 1 in 100 or less. Well, in that situation, you don't need to do anything. But it's definitely stress test the system. Try during the early implementation times. Get your scanner in, test it with large number of slides. When we did this at Granada, we tested with 10,000 slides to see what scanning times would be, to see what the error rate would be, etc., etc. And then we acted accordingly. So no shame in playing around, as long as you write down the results, right? That's the scientific method at the end of the day. So it's trial and error.
Yes, thank you, Juan. Another question from Yıldırım Karslıoğlu, Memorial Group. Our discussion is about the storage and the archive. The question is about the archive. I would like to ask about a very important point, which is the digital archiving and its needs for storage space, as well as the work on the side of information technology teammates. How did you find a working and sustainable solution? Thank you.
Yeah, so you know, archive can come in many flavors. So you know, the early adopters did not use cloud because, you know, back in those days, cloud was still not a viable option, or it was very expensive. So a lot of what the early adopters did was to buy on-premises storage, so large servers to keep everything on premises. Today, cloud is actually cheaper and more viable solution than what it was, you know, 5-10 years ago. You know, the beauty of cloud is that essentially it does require little upfront investment, that it is accessible from everywhere, and that essentially you can buy as you need, right? So those are the, you know, the 2 points that you have to balance, on-prem versus cloud. Again, certainly the cloud offers flexibility and advantages that, you know, you do not have with on-premises deployments. So definitely, you know, having a cloud solution is definitely recommended. Another thing to bear in mind is, right, what happens with very long-term archival solutions? Can this be made on premises? It can be made on premises. So the question is to try and find, you know, a cloud provider that basically suits your needs in terms of, you know, short, medium, and very long-term storage, and see whether a combination of cloud and on-premises is doable. Perhaps you decide that everything can be sent to the cloud. Perhaps you decide that everything can be actually, stored on-prem. So again, no hard and fast rules, but, you know, cloud is definitely a better solution than what it was 5 years ago.
Thank you, Juan. I can ask a question. ROI in pathology means region of interest, but for digital pathology, return of investment is also a great challenge in digital pathology. Can you say something, because in Turkey, in Granada University was a public hospital. I'm working in a private hospital. And in Turkey, we are discussing how to find the money for digital pathology and return of investment. Would you say something about that?
Yeah, that is a very controversial point because, you know, essentially with digital pathology, what you're going to achieve is an increase of efficiency in the pathologies that you have. Now, some pathologists say, well, you know, if I'm going to be 20% more efficient, I should be paid 20% more, right? Because, you know, I'm seeing 20% more cases, so I should be, you know, compensated accordingly. Certainly, what we did in our medium, in our situation, was that there were a number of retirements that were not replaced on purpose, and essentially because we couldn't find suitable candidates. So essentially what that meant is that the existing pathologists were able to cope with increasing workloads, which basically saved money to the public institution. Now, the question is, if you prolong, you know, these savings, when do you recover your investment? And in our experience, you know, the investment can be recovered, you know, usually anywhere between the 2nd and the 3rd year following implementation. But of course, you have to be fully digital for that, right? So essentially, if you assume that the typical life of you know, scanner is 5 years, that means that you recover your investment between the 2nd and the 3rd year, and you still have 2 additional years in which the scanner will be saving money. So this is how the return on investment comes into place. But essentially, it hinges largely on the gained efficiency by the pathologist, the ability of your pathologist of increasing, you know, the productivity. That is, in our experience, how you justify the investment. Does that mean that the pathologists will not be compensated for the extra effort? No, I think, you know, everybody should be compensated fairly, and, you know, there is an efficiency gain there. can we split here the difference? Can we actually split the difference, some of it to be reflected back to the pathologist, some of it to be reflected back to the institution? I think that would be the fair thing to do, right? Because at the end of the day, if you assume greater responsibility, that should be reflected on your compensation as well. But essentially, this is the dialogue that needs to be had, and the point where the return on investment calculation has to be made.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Another question came. İrem Onur asks, what are the challenges you have faced when using this system on cytopathology placements? I'm concerned on the probable problems, especially with the conventional non-gynecological smears.
Yeah. So in reality, all the clinical grade scanners in use today, all of them that have FDA approval, essentially are approved for histopathology only, for tissue-based pathology. Everything else, so cytology, the problem there is that cytology can be distributed in a three-dimensional situation, which means that you need a Z-axis scanner. The problem with Z-axis scanners is that they take longer to digitize, and the resulting file size is going to be very large. So because essentially you are digitizing several slices, whereas with a histology scanner, you're digitizing a single plane. With a cytology scanner, you'd be digitizing several planes in order for the entire cytology to be in focus. So that means that today it's not very practical yet to digitize cytology because the scanning times are very, very long, and the file size of the resulting file is actually huge, is massive. So for this reason, many early adopters are opting for keep cytology, everything cytology based on the digital workflow, on the glass workflow. So that is the rationale for that. So cytology and digital today are not that practical yet. Still, it is not long before it will be resolved, but today it's still not doable for the most part.
For today.
For today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another question, Türkan Atasever Rezanko asks, according to your experience, how many digital slides should be read by a practicing pathologist without having a risk of making a major diagnostic mistake? I mean, what is the optimal number of slides per pathologist in your digital pathology practice, both for optimal workload and not making any mistakes? Thank you.
So I think that really depends, again, on the individual pathologist. I mean, you see some pathologists in private practice in the United States who see very large volume of slides, which is very different to what you see in pathologists reading in academic institutions. So, I'm afraid that I do not have a magical number, but this is no different to what it would be on the glass workflow. It is no different in that sense. So we all have a limit as human beings, and we know that the human concentration is not infinite. And we know that we all get distracted and tired eventually. So we all have individual limits. So therefore, it's very difficult to put, a general recommendation that would be valid for everyone. What is valid for a private pathologist is very different than that for an academic pathologist. And we know that. So glass has limitations, and digital is no different in that regard.
Workload is a big problem to solve in pathology because you cannot put at the same thing every case, or for example, the number of the slides can be a measure of the workload. No, a true cut biopsy sometimes makes us to work on for a week, for example. Then you can sign out a resection of 100 blocks in 1 hour. So the workload is the problem in pathology, and digital pathology doesn't solve it, you say, huh?
No. It will make it more efficient. You will waste less time looking for slides, taking measurements, counting mitosis. But everyone has a limit, and digital pathology will help you perhaps stretch that limit a little bit, but it won't do any miracles, I'm afraid. So yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Juan. Our time is 20:40. Time passed so fast with you. We have time. We can have some questions, and I can share that. Juan will be with us with an other session about AI and prostate algorithms and breast algorithms they worked on later on these webinars. Thank you, Juan, to join us, to share your experience. It was so great and amazing. I listened to you so many times, but it was just as it was the first time that I listened to you. Thank you.
That's so very kind. It was my pleasure to be here, and I can't thank you enough for the invitation. It was really very enjoyable experience. So looking forward to the next one.
Okay.
It was an honor for us to host you here. Thank you very much for your kind experience, sharing your experience with us. And it was really a kind of eye-opening for us, especially for the pathologists like me who has not much experience on digital pathology. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay.
This is the end of our first session. Çok teşekkür ederiz bütün katılımcılara. Sanırım devam edeceğiz daha sonra, ileriki haftalar, ileriki aylarda diyeyim. Onların duyurularını da daha sonra kısa bir zaman içerisinde tek tek yapacağız sanırım. İlknur, son olarak söyleyeceğim başka bir şey yoksa kapatalım.
Teşekkür ediyorum tüm katılımcılara. Birlikte olmak, sorular çok güzeldi. The questions were so good. I think that Juan, what do you think? I don't know. And it was so amazing to have so much questions, so different questions from every side. So it was amazing for me to with all of the audiences, with you. So thank you very much. Our next webinar is on July, end of July. And we will share the program later on, and we will be so happy, Juan, if the English webinars, we can invite you for the others. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Tüm katılımcılara çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Sağ olun. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere.